everyone. My name is Cindy Bassi. I am a third-year MDiv student at the School of Theology here at Boston University. And this is a little bit of an overview of what the 3 years have been for me and the projects that I have engaged in during that time. So first, 3 years ago, around 3 years ago, I had the opportunity to visit you during one of those Wednesdays community lunches. And I happened to have grabbed my lunch and go and sit down, and guess what? I was sitting right next to Tom Ford. And so he, very intuitive, started asking questions, and how are you doing? And I was like, well, I'm from Colombia. I have been here for around 16 years. I have 3 kids. I grew up as a Catholic, but I am interested in Buddhism. And he was like, I sense conflict in this one. And he was like, you should really take the RCT. That would be a good idea for you. And sure enough, like he saw me on the spot. He had a flyer, and he's like, "Here you go, I'll take you with you." And that was really the framework of my entire classes here at BU. From that moment on, I set up everything around that, it was precisely through that introduction that I started knowing, and I remember that you were sitting right next on the other side of the room, but I didn't have a chance to talk to the Buddhists at the time. So through the RCT, that first fall, we had a fall retreat, and it was in collaboration with the Faith and Political Justice. And again, that led me through following that program. And that introduced me to the conflicts that are not between human beings, but the conflicts that we have with nature, the conflicts that we have with the divine in nature. And I grew up in Colombia, as I mentioned before, and as I was listening to the Latin movement, I grew up hearing about the horrors of colonization, and immersed in that culture. It was the use of religion as a tool for evangelization, right? To colonize the indigenous people. So in a way, it was for me. It was this dichotomy, this conflict that I had, and I walked away from the religion and started moving towards Buddhism. In my second year, I applied for a scholarship at the New York Center for Contemplative Care in New York. I got it, and I went through a foundation of contemplative care at the same time that I was here. And what I really got from that was a really great foundation for a spiritual practice that allows me to provide care or being present in conversation with other people when I am doing chaplaincy, when I'm talking about any issue, conflict, transformation. It really set me up in a way that I feel that I have those skills, and wherever I go, So I wanted to mention that because, as I again, Buddhism continues to be around my work. I'm going to be jumping because of time, but this semester I am taking a class which is dismantling white supremacy, and it's in the format of a circle. But last semester, with one of my classmates, we participated in a competition that BU built lab, and it was around providing a resource for BIPOC communities to learn about social and emotional aspects. And so we ended up winning second place, but it was about supporting through codes and information about how you could do this at home. You could support your family, you could support your kids. I will continue this work this summer, actually. I'm going to be working with Racism Leader and the Chelsea Leader Family Network providing these services. So, and this is the last thing that I'm going to talk about. This was my way to the work of the RCT, the work from the Faith and Political Justice, and the Land Use Studies program. Why did I choose Rio Grande? I mean, it's not like I crossed the border like that. But to me, it was important to bring attention to something that is a symbol. We know where is the river. We have heard of the river. How many of us have crossed it? None. But we know that it's there. So for me, it was very important to bring attention to a body of water that even though we are familiar with it, if we don't know about that is so big and has such a big representation in this country and has such a big representation from Latin America, then how is that we're going to get in touch with the bodies of water that we have around? With the watershed that provides water for us, that is the source of life for us. So for me, it was a way to get to the point, and also to talk about immigrant conflict. What happens when we have a river that is stripped of its nature, of its spirit? What happens when we use that as a way to separate bodies, as a way to separate ideas, as a way to end the imagination of different countries, of different people when they want to conflict, as a way to uphold white supremacy and white privilege. So I actually, through the Hispanic Summer Program, I got to meet Dr. Cabarez. I got in touch with other people. I was able to, with the collaboration and the support of Dr. Copeland, I was able to reach out to Richard Blanco, which is the inaugural poet for Obama, and we got some people here to talk about it. And my intention with this was to provide just the seeds. Maybe it's dormant and it will never flourish, but I think that initiating this conversation is important, and it's a way for me to continue this work in any format, whether it's in chaplaincy, whether it's in ecological justice work, whether it's in conflict transformation. I think that the framework was there from the time I met Tony Porter. So thank you. I'm really happy. I'm very excited for me and for all of you.
Questions, comments?
So thank you so much. It was a joy to read your paper. I was thinking about, as you were speaking, with your unique journey in your personal faith through like cultural Catholicism into Buddhism and wherever you're at now. Do you think there's a role for you in that space? Because I'm a Catholic ethicist, and I work with John McCransky at Boston College, and one of his books is Why Buddha Makes Me a Better Christian. And so thinking about, I think a lot about, interreligious dialogue and sharing across faith traditions. And I'm just so curious about, alongside your ecological work, alongside the intersectionality you're bringing in those conversations, do you also see that happening more particularly in your religious engagement?
Something that I didn't talk about, it was the work that I did with the CP. And I think that the CP for me was really helpful in going through that conflict that I had from growing up, going to basic school with nuns and learning from them and seeing these amazing women being independent and teaching and doing all these things, and then at the same time being being trained by this institution. And on the other side, I was learning about colonization and everything that happened. So it was like, do you realize what you're teaching me here? And then when I came and when I started getting a little bit closer to Buddhism, I realized that there is a lot of those traditions that are really embraced, that are really loved to live. And through the discerning process of CP, like ruling process of CP, I realized that I didn't have to choose one. That it wasn't about choosing and giving my back to all the beautiful things that I have from Catholicism, or the values that I learned from that, all the service that I really got when I was with all the nuns and my friends, and would work as a child with them, in Colombia, and at the same time, I didn't have to choose living Buddhas or taking the bus. That was the other part, because I don't really didn't like doing that. So in finding that piece, in finding the interconnectedness of that also both, I really felt that I was doing something that really worked.
One more minute for questions.
Pretty sure.
I always want to know about how you're integrating watershed discipleship. You talked about it a little bit.
Yes,
Please talk about it more.
I know. We had this amazing class with Dr. Copeland. It was watershed discipleships, and it was I took it as my it was one of the requirements, but it was I remember. Our watershed discipleship was about how we bonded in elements, and in particular elements of water. So during that class, we talked about Boston and how I had been living here for 19 years, and I had no clue about like the day and where the water is coming from, and where the water is being. And I didn't know anything. So all of us, we had to go back to our watersheds and learn about them and connect them. And that's how actually this project started. Like, how is that we connect? How is that we respect, value, and find it
Good morning, everyone. My name is Thomas Brown. I'm a third-year MDiv student here. I think for me, in reflecting on my time here, it was important for me to think about what kind of led me to come here. So my background, I studied religion, human rights in undergrad, and so when I came to visit here, I happened to meet Judith Olson, and I think there's a proselytizing program has. And so she also had a flyer. And so when I talked about my background in academic studies, she said, you know, the RCT program sounds like a great addition to that. So that's kind of one of the things that led me to come to BU and study here. So my area of studies is in religion and international relations, and so for this paper in particular, I kind of wanted to reflect on my personal journey that kind of incorporated with my academics, but also like personal transformation. And so, the paper from interpersonal to international kind of addresses that. So I wanted to kind of sketch out a framework of conflict transformation that considers interpersonal relationships as a locus for conflict transformation. So I began by talking about transforming the individual, and so I think the spirit and art of conflict transformation, that class was a very important class for me to learn about my conflict styles in addition with personal therapy. Yay, unpacking trauma. Because I grew up in a family dynamic where conflict was like the nuclear. Like if there's conflict, there was something bad, and so conflict always had a negative connotation to it. And through this class, I realized like, sure, conflict can be bad, but conflict can be a mode to kind of have a positive place for transformation and to create kind of something new and to kind of grow and learn from that. And so I realized, like, you know, particularly with my conflict styles of being a high harmonizer and a high avoider, that I would silence my own voice whenever there was conflict, and you know, speaking your own voice and adding your experience is an important component to conflict transformation, and understanding oneself. And another component to that was David Anderson Licker says that conflict is two ideas trying to share space. And so I never really heard that before, because again, like conflict was negative, but you know, conflict doesn't necessarily have to be negative. So that was kind of like the starting point there. And then I get into talking about engaging, encountering different worldviews. And so I took a class with Chloe at Harvard called Negotiating Cross Worldviews. You can go ahead and do the next slide. So here we engaged with interdisciplinary readings and reflections to help us become more aware of our own and others' worldviews, and how that influences conflicts and involving identity and value differences. And so one of the things that we talked about is the ladder of inference. So the ladder of inference, it starts from the bottom, it kind of goes up to the top. So it begins with this like pool of observable data. So these are just kind of like everything kind of experienced in the world. And so you choose the available data and that you've observed or experienced. And then based on your cultural or personal location, you add value to that and make assumptions and then draw conclusions and develop beliefs and take actions for that. So this is a helpful tool. So you can kind of see the framework I'm sketching out of learning your own worldviews, own conflict styles, own kind of identity as a means to understand where other people are located. And so I think this was a helpful tool to me to kind of engage with that. And so then kind of taking this as far as like engaging with the world of interpersonal relationships as a means to transforming international conflict. So you can keep reading. So I'm taking a class now, Religion and Global Politics at Harvard, and so this kind of deals with a lot of like theory and like critical genealogies, but I think there's some important things to kind of take of like having interpersonal and international together. And so one of the things that we talked about was the Liberian Civil War. And if you've ever seen the film Pray the Devil Back to Hell, it's a great film. And it kind of talks about how Liberian women, Christian women, Muslim women came together and kind of transformed the conflict in Liberia. And so you kind of see these interpersonal conflicts, or interpersonal relationships develop to transform Liberia and their civil war. And so an important thing to note also is in peace studies there's the concepts of positive and negative peace. And so negative peace refers to just like the cessation of violence, but peace is more than the cessation of violence. So positive peace kind of incorporates these concepts of systems and structures that sustain individuals and communities, that support human creativity and flourishing. So this is also kind of where the concept of when we talk about just peace, of not just like having structures like education, housing, food equity, things like that, in order to kind of end long-term violence. And so I think this is where developing interpersonal relationships is important for transforming communities that experience conflict. So I have a minute left, about a minute left. So so I think for me this program was it's hard to kind of reflect on it now because we had a very atypical experience with COVID, and so but I think there's a lot of meaning that can be drawn from it and that I will reflect on later. It's hard to kind of reflect on it now when you're finishing a degree, but I think overall this has been a very valuable experience to help me grow personally and also engage with my academic interests. And so, yeah, that's kind of where I'm at. So. 8 minutes is a good question. Any questions or reflections? Yes, Chloe.
I've heard you talk about this a lot, but I was just wondering, like, how do you see the interpersonal relationships going into, like, your future work? Like, what kind of work do you see coming out of learning more about your own conflict style and then taking that into informing other people on how to do the same?
That's a good question. I mean, the first kind of word that came to mind was vulnerability. So I'm like a big Renee advocate.
Our words.
So she's also been an important person to kind of help me along the journey of learning more about myself and like kind of confronting my conflict styles and like my own personal identity. And so I think having a sure sense of one's identity positions themselves better to engage in conflict transformation because you have the idea of where you're coming from, but you also have the tools necessary to see where other people are coming from. And so, the work that I'm looking at going into kind of is in this NGO human rights sphere that takes religion as a component in understanding where people's worldviews are coming from as a means to transform conflict.
Time for one more question.
Just out of curiosity, do you have a particular international policy dream job, or is there a particular issue that you are passionate about? You mentioned Liberia. I don't know.
Yeah, so that was just the example. So I actually wasn't made aware of this until I took conflict transformation of USIP, United States Institute of Peace. So like, I think that would be like a great job to get into. But knowing I would need to have more experience or maybe more education to get there. But something like that, I think, would be a great space to work in.
Thank you.
Is that it?
That's it.
Hi everyone. My name is Flo Glynn, and I am a third-year Master of Social Work and Master of Theological Studies. And today I'm going to share a little bit about my framework for conflict transformation and some of the inspirations for that and aspirations for the future. So the first thing, which I think Thomas kind of got at a little bit in my framework that I'll talk about, are some of my main principles. So one is that conflict is natural. So conflict is like ecologically, to get to Cindy's presentation, ecologically inherent to the ways that we are and exist as beings who are connected and are connected with other beings. And something that I think about with this a lot is a concept in the Islamic Sufi tradition, which is the union of union and separation, which is a concept that reflects our human relationship with the divine. And the idea is that we are always interconnected, and in that interconnectedness, which is the union, sometimes we really experience that sense of connection, and we're aligned, and we have these values in common, and we're like strategizing together, we're doing everything together, we're totally like connected. That's the union of union. And also there are times when we have a feeling of separation, where there's a disconnect, where there's a divergence, and we all have needs, where we have our individualities as much as we are connected, and sometimes these individualities come to conflict with each other, which also connects with this other phrase that I once heard in relation to conflict, which is to strike together as the etymological roots of conflict. And that's something I often think about, is just how we can strike together, and how, to go on to that second principle that I have, how that can generate some positive potential for the relationship. Kind of like how when, I don't know the proper terms for this, but like when you're striking a match, right? And you're creating a spark, you're creating a potential for fire, for warmth. And sometimes that fire can be really explosive, and sometimes that fire can be life-saving. And so when I think about the potential of conflict for something generative, it's not to downplay at all the violence that can come out of conflict, the harm, but it is to emphasize that there are potential ways to respond to conflict and to be healed in naming and sitting with conflict in a way that really acknowledges the pain and the harm, and that aims to fulfill our responsibilities and obligations because of the harms that have been committed, that can be transformative. My third one, which I've kind of already gone into, is how conflict transformation has to be grounded in our interconnectedness. There are a lot of great authors to talk about this, Howard Thurman being one of the best ones, but I'll just read a quote from the First Nations leader Harold Gansby, who says, "We are all related. If you can't seem to find a circle anywhere, just look into the pupil of another person's eye. The earth is a circle and is made up of 80 to 90% water, and so are our bodies. People will always be 80 to 90% more alike." So that's that. And my other principle, conflict transformation must be contextual and adaptable. And I think I'll just tie this in with some of the other ones that I have. So conflict transformation must center itself in and be guided by people most harmed by conflict. It requires an awareness of oneself and how one's presence shapes the experiences of others. And it must lead to an equitable and just society. So all of that entangled together is really what I'm talking about there, is that conflict transformation needs to be not, needs to work to not perpetuate the systemic injustices that are very present in our society. And relating to what I talked about earlier with conflict being very natural, I think there is a component of conflict that occurs maybe in an unnatural way, in the sense that power and power differentials produce culture, and they produce our ways of interacting interpersonally. And these power differentials are often unjust, and when we do not address them as people involved in conflict transformation, then we probably won't really ever get to the root of what is creating the conflict. So we need to be very aware of how those power, those injustices of power are coming up in the local context. So what it looks like here at the BU School of Theology, and the ways that our institution fails people to my home in Northern Virginia in DC, where there are many other kinds of politics going on at play, but also that are often related. It can look very different, so we have to be adaptable to who are we with and what are the histories and the present issues at play. And it also needs to be really grounded in the people who are most harmed by the conflict, because if we're following a mentality of neutrality in conflict transformation, we risk losing the fact that it wasn't already neutral from the beginning. And then we can very easily maintain a difference of power, which can often result in actions that aren't actually just. And so I'm thinking a lot about actually the mediation course we had, where that's actually one of the major principles of mediation, is you have to be neutral. And that was something that a lot of my classmates and I were wrestling with, like, is that okay? What if something comes up, like a really terrible act of racism, and we're going to try and like compromise on addressing racism? There has to be ways of interpersonally connecting with people to move forward and to address the conflict, but not without letting go of principles of anti-racism and other issues. That's just one example. Also, something that is important to me in that is that as a white person and a person with many other privileges as well, and also who experiences some forms of not privilege, disadvantage, I suppose oppression maybe, that I be aware of how I bring myself into the space and how my presence affects you all or anyone else, and ensures that I am not seeking to dominate. Kind of referring to that prayer that you had, Bishop Susan, of oneness with creation instead of domination with creation. So all in all, that's my framework. And then the last piece of it, how much time?
You're out of time.
Oh, I'm so out of time. I didn't even see it. Okay, great. Just one last thing I'll end on is that the idea of restorative and active spaces, I think, gets at this idea of justice, is that when we're doing our work, it can't just be personal, it has to be political. We have to be doing advocacy work, not just interpersonal work.
We have like 4 sweet minutes for questions.
This isn't a question, it's more of like a comment. So the metaphor that you use, the lighting the match, like lighting a match is very neutral, right? So like you said, it could be used to light a fire or it could like use it to cause harm, right? And so that kind of reminded me of the latter inference of how like, you know, we can, a very neutral thing of lighting a match can both lead to different outcomes and different assumptions and beliefs and kind of actions. So I just kind of wanted to respond to that.
Thank you.
I'm just curious, maybe you answered this question to the end, but what would you say is the main contribution of social work to the way we understand conflict transformation and peace here at SPA? Like, general.
Yeah, I mean, so for me, the main contribution of social work is really bringing the active space piece, because I'm a macro social worker, and so I'm very involved currently at the Mayor's Office for Immigrant Advancement at the City of Boston as a policy advocate. And so I am learning a lot of the ways that we actually can be active and how we can organize as communities, how we can learn, how we can intersect with the policy world and make a change in that world, and the challenges of doing that, and how I can bring that with me wherever I go, and creating those restorative spaces that can then lead into spaces of advocacy.
Thank you.
Which 120 seconds.
Do you want to stick with policy work, or are you considering your journey next?
Yeah, so I know my next step is going to be working at the LGBT Resource Center at the University of Utah, working as a program coordinator. So I'll be developing and I'll be doing programming around community building with queer students, as well as advocacy, like at the institutional level, and also hopefully kind of, you know, a little bit beyond for queer students and queer folks in Utah and so on.
Good morning, everyone. Oscar Guana is my name. We use 2 last names. You know, the first one is for my father, second for my mother. So I am from Colombia, and I don't know. There's so much to say. I'm sorry. It's going to be like a lot of pieces like all together there. But you know, being born in Colombia in the mid 80s and 1980s, and doing my undergrad in agronomy in a state university in Colombia, like, I don't know, maybe it's because of that, but I am very focused on the structural of everything, of the politics of everything. Like, that's the way I think. I know that's not the whole picture, but that's like my focus, right? So, so with the picture, this is kind of what I'm thinking all the time about, right? So, so Latin American societies are very unequal, right? So we are one of the most unequal regions in the world. In Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And our countries have problems to guarantee, you know, the rights of people. So our democracies are like weak, and actually many countries come from dictatorships in the second half of the last century. So my question is why? Why does that happen? Why is that our situation? And well, and actually, what's happening today in the religious realm in Latin America and several countries is that Christians, because we are mostly Christian, Catholic, and evangelical Pentecostal Christians, we are supporting authoritarian and right-wing agendas in countries. So you can see Brazil, you can see to Colombia. So that's what's in my mind always, right? And in that context, I understand and I agree, and it's great to know, as maybe Thomas shared, yeah, conflict is two ideas trying to be in the same space. But that's, for me, that's not the whole story. Because that's right, okay, that works and functions, but conflict can also be two interests competing for one thing. And that's different, right? Because it's not, oh, we have a difference here. No, we have a common interest, and I'm going to take you down to take that, what I want. So that's why I'm talking about liberation theology and post-colonial theologies as important for peace building and cultural transformation in Latin America. So we are mostly Catholic countries, Christian countries, so you would say liberation theologies are great for that context. Well, liberation theology is very is banned practically. I came to the US to learn about liberation theology. You cannot mention that in our countries because that's guerrilla, that's communism, so that's a big no-no. So that's a great big challenge there, but I want to wrestle with that and try to learn how to do this preferential option for the poor today, even though liberation theology is so stigmatized in our country. So there's that. And the other is, we see this in Colombia, this social, in Latin America, this social conflict. And to me, one of the biggest major causes of this social conflict is colonialism and neo-coloniality in basically the US. So I don't think we're talking about that as seriously as we need to, back there and here. Mm-hmm. So that's like what I have here, like always in my heart, in my mind. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do too, right? And that influence of the US is also powerful over Christians. So the reason why we Christians in Colombia, in Latin America, are supporting right-wing political authoritarian agendas has a lot to do with the influence of the US. I mean, not only in Cold War, post-Cold War era, but right now. And so I want to end with two things. things. So we talk about reconciliation a lot in conflict transformation. So that I question reconciliation between who, right? Because how can we reconcile with an oppressive state? I think that's a utopia, right? Are they going to repent and recognize or acknowledge all their injustice? That's not going to happen. That has not happened. That's my view. Who needs to reconcile? The oppressed. We need to reconcile between ourselves because we have been divided by those discourses from the top. That's why we are killing each other as poor and oppressed people. We are the ones who need to reconcile between ourselves to resist and overthrow them. I don't know how that sounds, but and so finally, the last thing I want to say here to try and conclude this is I see a big need for research and liberation theology in a post-colonial lens will allow us to integrate the marginalized voice, the voices that have been marginalized in our research to do scholarship like grounded in the grassroots, I mean in the everyday life of people. I have missed that so much here, to be honest. We have had some great classes that have, like, I really connected with everyday life people, like everyday struggles, but that's not the most of what we study here. Right? So I would love to, like, looking at the future, I would like to really do research from a post-colonial lens that integrates all those marginalized voices and that promotes like theology and religion in a liberative perspective. I told you this was right. Thank you.
I really appreciate your comment about how it's the oppressed who need to reconcile with each other, and it reminded me of my understanding of the politics campaign in the United States is exactly that all the DBLT and Black Lives Matter and feminists that we all need to reconcile with each other in order to make a better world.
Thank you for that. Yeah. What's like concerning for me is that those movements are so like in a moment, just that. So everybody mobilizes. There are a few months of like this, and then we forget. I think there's a challenge there. Thank you.
I just want to affirm that what you're saying is like something that needs to exist here too. Like part of what you were saying about people, oppressed peoples coming together reminds me of something that Martin Luther King said about having a conversation with one of the white jailers while he was in Birmingham, and saying like, don't you see that they're doing what to you what they do to me, and you're just thinking you're on their side? Like this is not new. Like this is something that has existed in every country forever, because the easiest way to control people is by the people at the top getting the people at the bottom to see each other as enemies.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that you're right on the money with that.
Thank you. Thank you. Dan?
Indeed, yes. Something that I was thinking about, sort of a merger between international relations and theology, is when you were talking about sort of the beauties, but also very much limitations of truth and reconciliation commissions when they are fully implemented, particularly in a place like Colombia. And I was wondering how if you're seeing any elements of good sort of theological conversations and or movements in a liberative way even that sort of maybe helps that sort of reconciliation process be quote unquote better, more possible, versus just having a secularized let's have our truth and reconciliation with the oppressive government to the peoples.
Well, in my I think final minute,
Right.
the Truth Commission in Colombia is presided by a Jesuit priest,
Right.
who is you need to learn from him. So there's a big potential to theologize on this in Colombia, especially. And at the grassroots level, the local churches, evangelical churches, have dealt with all the war, and there's a lot to be said there. So that's kind of something that I would like to go into, the research of that. So yeah, there's a big potential to theologize in truth and reconciliation in Colombia in this aspect, for sure. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Yeah, my name is Kenneth. Lisa, sorry. Lisa is my father's name. My last name. So, mediating different perspectives among faith communities is like the topic I'm going to take you through. But before then, I want to take you through the project that led to this thing. Yeah. Last fall, I was engaged in a project. This was to investigate asylum seeker housing resources with the Belmont Water Methodist Church. So this project will transition to the spring, and this has continued until I'm in my last semester, but still I have to submit a paper towards this proposal. Yeah. The spring semester has kind of brought me to the space where I can have deeper conversations and having those to dialogue with ideas and perspectives I generated from the field. So the project, as you can see there, asylum seeker housing resources, but the goal was to engage local churches and the key dialogue partners within the faith communities to how they can be conduits to support housing, in providing housing resources for asylum seekers and other immigrants as well. So the forms of housing I was looking at is transitional housing as well as affordable housing. Transitional, there is a limbo. When an asylum seeker makes a crime, it takes usually 2 years, 1 year to file the case, another year waiting for a response, or the case is still under application. The 2 years is when someone has got the employment authorization document or the case has been had by an immigration officer and the decision has been made. So there are those transitional phases where they lie in the limbo and they need services. Personally, issues of asylum they belong to my heart. Personally, I'm an asylum seeker. I arrived in this country in 2015. I went through similar struggles to find housing and the transition through several layers of my life. So, for the purpose of this study, asylum seekers are persons who arrive at recognized point of entry at the airport or at the US southern border with Mexico, as well as humanitarian cases, immigrant visa holders or parole. We are seeing the number of asylum seekers, those who are Afghan refugees. Now we're seeing Ukrainian, we see countries coming from the Northern Triangle, we see the Haitian refugees. These all fall within the categories of asylum seeker. And there are so many other asylum seekers that arrive in this country out of the radar. So there are so many. So what are the challenges? The challenges these people arrive, generally they lack housing. There is also the need for legal representation for people who arrive at the airports and in places like Southern. There are other transportational challenges, language barriers, and other related challenges. So the method of can we rewrite that? So the method of learning was experiential, and I used the called experiential learning method. It's a circular process. It has 4 layers, and anybody can enter the learning process at any point. Concrete experience, reflective observation, abstract conceptualization, and active experimentation. So this is the process that I wanted to transform experience, learn from the process as well as transforming my experience. So these are the interview groups that I had a dialogue conversation with in my experiential learning process. This was my second Methodist Church. The New Gun Justice for Our Neighbor is an organization and application of the church. So I talked to the number of leaders within the Law and Lawrence Coordinating Center, the National JFON, the Justice for Our Neighbor, the Northeast Justice Center, the Lutheran Immigration and Refugee Services, and a number of these organizations as well as individuals. I talked to St. Paul's, the rector of St. Paul's, the Episcopal Church in the Newburyport, Bob Stein. Yes, and 4 other members who actually beneficial of the reflective structure dialogue model that I want to So points of concern, asylum seekers receive little or no assistance from the government. So this is the reality for, and I hope you can, now that you're in that high office, you can. So in many frontline host communities, like in the Boston area, rental costs are rising. If they are rising for us, people who are already in this state, how about these new immigrants who are coming? It's a tricky situation. So asylum seekers, look, the reality is they live in 2 years of limbo. When they arrive, and it takes them 2 years for their case to be heard or to ascertain the employment authorization. So housing resources for asylum seekers are limited. That's one area that came up as a point of concern. So themes, after having those diverse conversations, I generated 3 themes. One of partnership within the local-based communities and churches. So this is where like churches, like one single church can redirect idle resources, land, building, money to support affordable housing processes. Or locally conduct fundraising to steward the cause. The second option is partnership across organizations. So invest actually faith-based organization creating a network and raising resources. For instance, one congregation may have a legal land, another one may have volunteers with money, then they can convert those resources to see how they can support one cause. Then the other option is partnering with foundations for grants to develop such kind of models. Then the third and finally is the core of this, different perspectives. I don't know if this is visible. Housing, immigration, church, these were the center of my research. These are contentious issues. Immigration is a federal issue that has dominated our public square. Housing also dominates the public square in its own way. Church properties, again, within those parameters. Thank you. So these are contentious issues that I wrestled with, but of course these are also complemented by other challenges, navigating already established church missions or institutional missions, complexities and church finances, migration-related policies concerns, as well as these other challenges that complemented these already existing So, when it comes to the point of decision making, there are always tension in the field, in the institutions. This led me to the model that I want to tell you within few seconds. So I spoke about the reflective structured dialogue, and this is an essential partners model that brings together people from different perspectives and how they can have a mature conversation to resolve transform some of the challenges or make those critical decisions. So these are some of the notes that I took and perhaps could be very useful for us. It has been very helpful, the note has been helpful in speaking about issues of gun policy, issues of sexual orientation, race, and gender development, as well as it can be a good model, and it has facilitated dialogue within the Belmont political chat when they reach the point of making a redevelopment plan, selling part of their campus to concentrating one. They had two campuses, so they were thinking of selling one campus to one. There is another wonderful slide I wanted to share. Thank you.
You have 3 minutes for questions.
You said you were continuing. I'm just interested, how long will you be in the communities, and do you see your work in these communities forever, going forward? How long are you going to continue this process with them?
Yeah, for now I'm thinking about engaging with the church and coming to the proposal, then send it to the church. It's after the church deliberations. Not sure if they would be interested in furthering the connection with me, but this is one. But my area of is advocacy. And perhaps I can take your office when you need to.
Thank you.
Still have 2 minutes, right?
Yeah, you go wild.
Yeah, I mean, kind of going off of that, I was just curious, like, is your interest primarily in the church response to this concern, or the policy response, or is it a mixture of both?
I think it's a mixture of everything. It's a mosaic, I would say. How the church can complement policy, and it's like a very interesting part. The government is doing its part. The local people, non-profit organizations are also doing their part. The churches are also doing their part. But there is this relationship. Spirituality or religion has been playing a very critical experience for the migrants. They depend more, they kind of confide in the migrants. So having the church leading into the housing sector, where the government cannot provide, because the government doesn't provide any form of, let it be the national, the local, or at the federal level. They don't provide any form of housing. So there is that gap. So the church has to fix it, because it's a missional and historical obligation of the church, siding with the poor. Many of our conversations are centering on the liberation theology, so they are preferential for the poor, and the church, this is the mission of Christ, and it's extending that ministry. So on the policy front, yes, when that challenge is fixed, we are kind of complementing the policy.
I'm curious for what's your advice for churches, like small local churches that are not involved in this work? Like, what can they do to get started?
I'm so sorry to interrupt, but can you guys have that conversation at the break?
Sure.
Thank you.
Hello. I'm nervous because I'm not a morning person. Yeah. Okay. So there's a saying. Well, Christians in Colombia are non-Catholics, right? So there's a saying among Christians. We say, like, do you know what is worse than working in any organization? Working in a Christian organization. That's worse. because relationships are really bad. And what I understood working in this paper is that it is due to bringing the church style of addressing conflict to Christian organizations. And Pentecostal churches tend to avoid conflict. We avoid conflict. Conflict is something negative, something's wrong with your faith, if you don't know how to deal with your anger, you know, and we have tons of Bible verses to avoid conflict and to justify that. So when you come to an NGO to a Christian NGO, that's the recipe for disaster. So Oscar and I, because I'm Oscar's wife, we worked together in a couple of Christian NGOs back in Colombia, and that was terrible. And I think it was the word for that, and praise the Lord, Dr. Rambo is here. It was traumatic. Like, it was like, why is this happening to me? Trying to reflect on this, and now that I'm about to graduate, and if I go back to working in Christian NGOs, I just want to have strategies to deal with this, because I don't want to go through those bad experiences again. Because it doesn't make sense that we in Christian NGOs have such good projects. You know, we're helping everybody in Colombia, women and LGBTQI and people affected by war and all that stuff. But then you go to your office and it is hell, right? Like, we talk about peace and reconciliation and God's healing and all you can possibly imagine with communities, and then in the office it's like, I don't want to say this. So basically, this concept of progressive Pentecostalism was something important for me, because we Christians working with social justice and stuff, as Oscar said, we are communists, we are all that, you know, we are the worst. Like, why you're not working to save souls, you know, earth is temporary, blah, blah, blah. So something that I take with me from these 3 years is the idea of progressive Pentecostalism, because, you know, speaking about trauma, I was running away, I was trying to escape from Pentecostals when I moved to Boston. I don't know, I complained about this to God all the time, like, why did I grow up in a Pentecostal house? That was a nightmare. In a Pentecostal church, that was a nightmare. But progressive, because, yeah, Pentecostals are my group of Pentecostals around who were like, you're communists for working in social justice. Progressive Pentecostalism, basically, these authors managed to put in words why we work for social justice. So having that theological grounding for me is very important to go back to Colombia. To say, like, no, we also read the Bible. But these authors also noticed and identified the problems of Pentecostals creating NGOs. And they were really good at showing how we bring this avoiding conflict style to NGOs. So basically, at the end of the paper, I concluded that, well, this was not the end of the paper. I took those problems of these progressive Pentecostals, the problems they identified, and I tried to create like a dialogue with 2 authors. We studied in our conflict transformation, spirit and art of conflict transformation class. Tita. Like, come on, you have to see yourself, because you also avoid. So you have to work as a person to change the organizational environment. It's something I'm doing. I go to therapy because I avoid conflict, of course. And Dr. Julie Olson also talks about rituals. Something important that is something I felt we missed in the Christian NGOs. Like, we take for granted we're Christians, so we are brothers and sisters, so why bother in creating things that make us feel like a unity in this organization? So that's something that we miss. And you said in your dissertation that like rituals tend to lose meaning over time, but we didn't even try in Christian organizations. You know, like at least in the one I worked for the longest, there was not sense of community overall, because it was like, yeah, of course we're Christians, we love each other. So rituals are very important. So those two elements I want to bring to my next experiences, like try to push to please try to work in your beautiful personal self, but let's also try to create community. Two very obvious things, but that doesn't exist in progressive universities. So that was my
How are you? No, my question is, what you talk about the importance of rituals, and I was just curious if there's any particular rituals that you have in mind that are like significantly meaningful for you that you feel like you could bring into an organizational space.
Yeah. There was something that we used to do in InterVarsity in Colombia, because Oscar and I, we worked 7 years in what is InterVarsity in Colombia. And this is a very simple ritual that I would love we had done here at STH, but we never did it. That was have it taken like 5 or 10 minutes to ask, how are you today? Because we professionals, I'm a psychologist, so we working with communities with very hard human situations. We often come really devastated, crushed, loaded, you know, with all the things we're doing. So finding people willing to listen to you, like really how you are doing with your project, with your life, with your heart, that's something I would love to find in an NGO. Every Monday in the morning, let's check how we are, let's pray for each other, so we get ready to start our week.
Maybe just contribute that something that we have learned is very, very important is to model vulnerable leadership. Just maybe contribute that in if you think that's right, that's something necessary in this kind of organization.
Oh, that's such a complex topic, because it is true, but since we reproduce church in the NGO, and our Pentecostal churches are, you know, we are pastor worshippers, you know, both our experiences were like the boss, the NGO director, he has the last word in everything. Like, he has to be the king or the queen, you know, and that's exhausting. So that's a huge, important challenge as well. Like, how do we transform power structures? And I think I mentioned that, Stephanie, in the paper. So yeah, that's a huge challenge.
I wrote this on the side of your paper, and her name has already been invoked, but Brene Brown's Dare to Lead and her Leadership Institute, I just hear so much of her reflections in your wisdom. You're already on that track, and I hope that you're able to engage with resources like that that can embolden you even further to take this into what is obviously a really necessary space, because I have worked for about a decade now in nonprofit management. And hooey boy, you are right. We are beautiful souls, and we're trying our darndest, but our organizations very rarely reflect that spirit of truth and justice. So I encourage you forth, and I hope that you just keep the strength, because you've got it.
Hello, everyone. That's a lot of slides, so I'll just like point to you and then you can tick the button. All right. So hi everyone. So go ahead and sorry, I'm snapping you. I just want to point out my first slide. I have throughout my presentation, it's titled "Communicating in Communities: Dialogue and Restorative Justice, and I will definitely be talking about reflective dialogue because it's a really big thing for me. But I also wanted to point out some of my pictures that these are two of the big spaces that I spend a lot of my time in church spaces and in school spaces. So if you go to the next slide. These are just some of the classes that I took, so if you can go on to the next slide. So yeah, so these are some of the pictures of my church and school spaces. Up here I have some of the classes that I've worked with, and down here are some pictures of my youth group kids and some of the people from my church, my home church. And so prior to coming to STH, I spent 5 years as a substitute teacher, and so I was in school spaces a lot, but I also worked as the youth director at my church where I still work. And I constantly looked at both of these jobs and would compare them because I was always working with kids. And I realized that I didn't want to be a teacher. I've always known that because my mom's a teacher and my dad's on the school committee. So many educators in my family. I always knew all the pitfalls to teaching and had no interest in that life. But I did love working with kids. And so I loved my work as a youth director. And I realized that in this time that there were things I could do in the church with families and with children who were having hard times that I couldn't do in schools because schools just systematically did not have the structures in place to be able to support children and families in the way that I wanted to be able to. And so I came to the conclusion that I wanted to be a pastor so that I could create those spaces. And so that was a big part of why I came to BU in the first place and why I'm going into pastoral ministry. So if you want to move on to the next slide. So my paper focused on 2 questions. The first one being, how do we disrupt problematic patterns to allow for healing, transformation, and growth to be possible? And my second question was, how can we communicate in communities in ways that foster love and compassion and recognize the value and dignity of all people? Lots of words. But basically boiled down to this idea that, you know, in both places that I work, in both schools and in churches, there tends to be patterns that cause conflict or patterns that create systemic issues. And so I wanted to look at how can we disrupt those problematic patterns to create space for growth. And also, the specific patterns that I mainly focus on are patterns of communication. And how do we engage with one another in ways that are life-giving instead of death-dealing? So if you can move to the next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about restorative justice, and I just wanted to give as a framework Howard Zier, his definition of restorative justice being an approach to achieving justice that involves, to the extent possible, those who have a stake in a specific offense or harm to collectively identify and address harms, needs, and obligations in order to heal and put things right as possible. Now, because we talk a lot about restorative justice, but I also look at things from a transformative justice lens that takes this more to a macro level of not just waiting to be active after conflict has happened, but really focusing on how systems can shift themselves to work into this restorative form. Can you go to the next slide, please? So the 3 ethics of restorative justice that I looked at these are primarily from an education perspective, but I feel like they can be used everywhere. The first one is creating just and equitable learning environments. We're creating just and equitable environments in churches as well. The second one being nurturing healthy relationships. And the third is repairing harm and transforming conflict. So these come from Catherine Evans and Dorothy Van Deering about their ethics for how to create practices of restorative justice, particularly in education settings, but these are also ethics to be used in any settings. And if you go to the next slide, so this is another way of showing these, but I wanted to point out specifically because I kept coming across this image and the Trinitarian appearance of it spoke to me a lot as a Christian, that these are values embedded in our own faith, and the idea of these being a circle of unity and constant Trinitarian messaging. And that, we've talked a bit about liberation theology and this idea of justice being within our biblical principles, that we should be living this way as the Bible tells us as Christians. And then if you go to the next slide. So I said I would talk a little bit about reflective dialogue, and I did an internship with Essential Partners and continue to work with them on a as-needed basis. But really the things that I take primarily from reflective dialogue as being the most important are the emphasis on how to ask a good question, the asking questions to engage in hearing someone's story so that you can really get to know someone, rather than we tend to ask questions either in like a yes or no framework or in a like trying to get an actual answer framework, whereas this is more open-ended questions that invite people to really be vulnerable and to proclaim themselves. And the other thing that I think is really important within the framework of reflective dialogue are the agreements that you come into the space claiming. That they offer an opportunity for people to be vulnerable because you know that there's a set of rules in place to hold that container together. And lastly, just quickly on my vocational plans moving forward, I still plan on working in pastoral ministry, but that I also want to continue my work in schools as well. And I see this stuff really helping out in both spaces, as I've kind of mentioned throughout. Continuing to use circles and circle process and building communities within my church spaces, but then also using both the church and other community partnerships to sort of help schools where they lack support, to offer support from the community to be able to move forward in this restorative community model. And my last slide.
Heidi, can you say a little bit more about that intersection between school and community, particularly with restorative justice models?
Yeah, so I was trying to like rush through because I only have 8 minutes. But yeah, basically, so the whole idea of, there's a couple of components to it. There's the idea of having community supports for whether it be training people in dialogue or in facilitation and mediation and things like that, so that various community members can help schools. I have a really big thing about school disciplinary actions and how those lead to a lot of systemic problems. And so my dream is to remove sort of the administration from disciplinary actions and instead focus more on a family group conferencing model or a victim offender type model that helps families and students sort of engage in what conflicts have occurred so that they can hopefully learn and move out of this cycle of detention, suspension, that just leads to then prisons, and I can get into the whole cradle to prison pipeline, but that's a whole separate story. So that's one element of it. And the other thing is that a lot of families that have, like economic injustice and things that, whether it be like working partnerships with local boys and girls clubs or churches and stuff to create daycare spaces for families that can't afford it, or creating places where families that are lacking support or maybe need a babysitter or don't know how to cook proper meals, offering cooking classes, like any type of things that families maybe are lacking the support within their family structure, that they can look to the community to help support that. So yeah, anything else? Am I out of time? Any other questions? Yes.
This is so fascinating. Thank you. Chicago Public Schools is doing a pretty ambitious transformative education program. It might be interesting to look at the places, because they're it's very impressive to think about what are the existing models in education that you could kind of adapt and use so you're not like they're like in sync with you. But I was really impressed by there's some school districts that are investing, and I'm kind of watching them, right, to see, because they're probably also tracking whether or not the project, their interventions actually work. So you want to see, like, in time, are they seeing, you know, the pipeline issues, you know, so tracking some of that would be so fascinating, but Chicago's putting money behind it. It's impressive.
Yeah, I've definitely looked a little bit at Chicago. There's also some schools within the Boston area that are really trying to do this. I think there's also like a challenge between some schools, like here, restorative justice, and they're like, ooh, this is a fancy new buzzword we can use to make it sound like we're making a change, and we're really doing the same thing we've always done, but we're putting a fancy title on it. And so it's really difficult trying to navigate, like especially looking through research and stuff, what is actually restorative justice and what's just perpetuating the same models of harm that have been in place, but doing it under a different name and maybe adding like a fancy title in there. Yes.
So I really identified with your not wanting to be a teacher because both of your parents are in education. I feel that deeply in my soul. But I also recognize that, at least for me, like the fact that my parents were in education strongly affects how I see conflict. So I wonder if you could speak to that, if that's true for you too.
Absolutely. Yeah, the bottom line is absolutely. It definitely affects how I understand conflict. I know you and I have had, but I think that it affects me in a different way than it affects you because we've had conversations about this. My mom, for most of her career, was a special ed teacher, and she is amazing. I give her so many props for how much she advocates for students, but it is draining to be not only a teacher, but to be a special ed teacher. And there was a lot of, I knew that she dealt with conflict on such a heavy level in her career life that coming home, she just didn't want to deal with it. It was like you get so bombarded by, I mean, she, for the majority of her career, has worked in a lot of the lower income schools within the city as well. First at the middle school level and now at the elementary school level. And so she had, and being a special ed teacher, there was a special layer of economic disparity there and trauma. And so, yeah, that definitely, my life is conflict avoidance. I very much resonated with what Thomas said earlier about the harmonizing and conflict avoidance styles. Yeah.
Good morning. Good to be here. This is my name. That's my only slide, by the way. I'm a member of the leadership team for the RCT program, so I'm just very glad to be here. I think I'm here to say that you all passed, maybe. That's not my task. I'm here really to reflect back on things that I've learned from these presentations, and I want to begin by saying how important it is for me to be able to be here and participate in many meetings every month to talk about the program. But being here and bearing witness to the work that you do is the major gift that I could have, and it's the purpose of the program really. I've been thinking as I was listening to the presentations about 3 categories, and I think the RCT program at its best offers 3 things for people, and these are lenses, skills, and actions. Okay. Lenses, skills, and actions. So what I'm about to do is to reflect back at the presentations and see what I've identified as under those 3 categories. So lenses, I think lenses is like ways of approaching reality, and I think the RCT program invites people to reshape how we perceive reality. I think there's I've heard echoes of this, but in, for example, in Oscar's presentation, but there are conflicts that exist that we're unaware of. So they need to be named, and we need an actual kind of set of lenses to perceive things that are sort of underground. You know, there's harm that is being inflicted that sometimes is out of sight. You know, so lenses, I think, are ways of addressing what conflict is and how to address it. I know that this is a title of a paper that we'll hear from later on, but you know, the title of the program is conflict transformation, not conflict resolution, right? So it's not a task of identifying resolutions to problems. So here are some lenses that I've heard and detected in the presentations. So Flo talks a lot about interconnections, right? And that's a way of approaching reality, of perceiving how we, in many ways, are connected to each other. There were echoes and gestures towards the principles of anti-racism in your research. Oscar spoke of structural analysis, the ability to perceive things in a structural way, interconnected way. Made references to liberation and post-colonial theologies and to the ongoing presence of coloniality amongst us. Laura spoke of progressive Pentecostalism, and I'm using this as a lens because there are modes of knowing, I think, that communities build as they come together for worship that provide sort of lenses to perceive reality as well. So I want to name kind of your experiences and what you name with progressive Pentecostals as this form of lens. Several of you mentioned, especially the question of transformative justice and ethic of restorative justice. These are a couple of sentences that are marked in here about you know, how to build the framework to think of the ethics of restorative justice. Here are some notes that I had for skills. The obvious one, mediation. It showed up in several of your presentations. There, Kenneth spoke about several, I think, categories that I think relate to skill sets. So the experiential model by David Gold, the importance of community organizing. There was one slide that Kenneth shared with us that I think exemplifies Kenneth's own ability as a builder of networks. So there was one slide where there was like church names here, name of people, organizations, nonprofits that were helping, you know, to connect. And so here's a skill set, right, of building networks to accomplish a common goal. There, in Kenneth's presentation, even I noted the RSD model, reflective structured dialogue, so a way of conducting dialogue in a particular way. In Laura's presentation, there was the comment of offering a theological vocabulary for communities who lack vocabulary to talk about conflict. You know, that's one of the ways in which conflict gets avoided because there's no language for it. So it is kind of a skill set that I think it's important for us in theological education to name, to provide, to name conflict, to provide theological vocabulary for things that are happening amongst us. In Heidi's presentation, there is reflective dialogue, communication as a way of building better communal life, identifying patterns. That seems important to me. Circle process was named as well, and I know that all of you have some experience with circle processes as well. Here are some actions that I noted. Flo spoke of the creation of active spaces, policy, advocacy, and now there might be a transition here in the position from Flo to there is, Oscar spoke of the need of finding and struggling towards the reconciliation of the oppressed. Oscar as well and others spoke about the importance of research, that is action as well. But a particular type of research that includes marginalized voices. And I would add, and their knowledges and how they can shape different forms of knowledge. In Kenneth's presentation, there were actions involved with helping people find housing, as asylum seekers finding housing, and all the policies around that and advocacy around that. A lot spoke of rituals, importance of rituals, and how these rituals might create space for conflict to be named and dealt with. And Heidi spoke of disrupting patterns of communication. Love that. Right? That's kind of an active form of participation there, and that one, deploys in order to disrupt patterns that are present in institutions and organizations and communities. So this is my way of really reflecting back at stuff that I learned from you. Lenses, skills, and actions. So I'll conclude, I think my time is up, with a word of appreciation to all that you have done. Thank you for teaching us about it. Thank you for your commitment to the program. And thank you for sharing your experiences and knowledges with us. Thank you again.